Hey everybody, this is Ferdinand, one of the founders of the Growth Syndicate, and in this video I'm going to tell you a little bit about the power of account-based marketing combined with thought leadership. Now these are two things that are not often talked about as a combination, but it's a combination we found to be super powerful. It's something that has produced incredible results for some of the companies we work with, and I want to share a little bit about why this combination is so important. And it starts a little bit with the context. And that is that B2B marketing teams need to change the way they operate. And that's just because the context from which we're working has changed. The truth is, it's never been this easy to build a product. There's never been more competition on the market. And a really good example of this is the MarTech landscape, right? These are all the marketing tools that exist in 2011. And if you fast forward, almost 15 years, it looks something like this. It's a huge explosion of competitive alternatives, of tools, of products on the market. And even if you're in a newer category, it's just a matter of time until you see something similar because it's just easier than ever to build. And what we see as a result of this is that kind of like the classic digital marketing channels that people rely on, things like Google Ads, things like organic socials, they are becoming increasingly saturated and they're becoming less and less effective. Cost per clicks are through the roof. Open rates are lower than ever before. The more people leverage certain marketing channels, the more noise gets created in these channels, the less effective they are. And we see this directly with AI, where on the one hand, people are creating more products, and so there's more competition because of AI, but there's also more noise because everybody can now design images. Everybody can now write content. Everybody can now automate their comments, even if you shouldn't be doing that necessarily. It's creating a lot of noise. It's creating a lot of distraction. And if you pair that with the economic reality, which is that funding is more volatile than ever and markets are more volatile than they have been in a very long time, it really paints a picture where there's less momentum in the market. It's harder to grow, and the things that most marketing teams rely on simply do not deliver the results that they hope for. And I think a way to kind of look at this development is to think about how marketing teams have had to operate over the last 20 years or so, right? So prior to, let's say, the digital marketing age, brand reigned supreme, right? A lot of marketing teams would focus on brand. This is born out of kind of the B2C world. And marketing is not only brand, by the way, but brand was a key factor. And you would have big budgets. You would create big campaigns that targeted a large number of people. Like I said, this was born out of the B2C reality. You couldn't really target people based on intent. You were more limited in the data you could collect. So you really had to nail the foundations. You had to have a strong brand. You really needed to stand out, and you really needed to know your ICP and who you were targeting and what audience you were talking to and what would resonate with them and how they would reply. In the early 2000s, you had things like online ads, especially kind of the search ads like Google Ads, for example, PPC. The emergence of these technologies really made it possible for the first time to target intent at a scale that was never possible before. It also opened up a whole wave of new channels. And generally what happens if there is a new channel with a relevant audience on it, if you get in early, you can get disproportionately large results, and you can ride that wave up to a certain point, and at some point everybody catches wind and everybody gets on those channels, and then you start to see it become saturated and you start to see it perform less well. And this is what the lead generation era was all about, which I would say ran right up until around the pandemic in 2020, where companies were focused on generating leads. The quality of leads was often questionable. Everybody was creating content. The quality of content was not always clear. SEO was easier. Google Ads was cheaper. You could get pretty good reach in the early 2000s on Facebook and later on LinkedIn as well. And all of this kind of changed over the last 5 years, which brings us to today, which is where companies should be really be focusing on mastering demand. Now, don't focus too much on the terminology here, but essentially it's a combination of those basics of building a strong brand, standing out, really knowing your audience, really influencing the market and putting yourself out there as a really viable solution to the problems that your potential customers might have, but also leveraging the tools, the channels, the workflows that have been developed over the last 5 to 10 years in particular. So mastering demand is not just about capturing the demand that's on the market, it's about helping steer that demand, what some people call demand generation, capturing that demand and then converting that demand as well. And this, when we talk about this lead generation era, one of the big symptoms of this era is marketing teams talking about things like funnels and trying to create a lot of marketing assets and focusing on a lot of different tactics and playbooks and channels, but ones that are not always necessarily connected. So what we see a lot is we see a lot of marketing teams that do the right sort of thing. They have a pretty good idea of who their market is, who they're selling to. They have a pretty good idea of how the product works and what the key differentiating factors within that product are. And they create the right sort of things. They write blog articles, they create content, they post on socials, they make sure that they're featured on comparison sites like G2 and Capterra. They will do some SEO, maybe some Google ads, they'll do some email marketing. If they're really involved on the product side of things, especially in SaaS, they might be looking at PLG tactics and growth loops. They'll be supporting the outbound sales team with certain assets. They might be doing webinars, and very often kind of the individual assets and activities are not bad, they're just not connected. So you end up creating a lot of stuff that individual potential buyers only see one or two of, rather than actually really strongly engaging with your brand and gaining a lot of value from it over time. Well, I love to point at this example from Liam Maroney when he talks about how he decided to buy SparkToro being a tool for audience research, topical research, SEO, and these sort of things. And he starts off by saying that he's been a fan of the founder, Rand Fishkin, for years, right? This is something that's super hard to emulate. It's super hard to measure. It's not something that is really a repeatable playbook. It's just a fact that, he knows Rand, he's followed his content, and he respects him. Then he talks about all the videos that Rand releases and how sometimes he'll share those videos with his colleagues. Maybe he'll post them on Slack. And he talks about all these different touch points, which include word of mouth. It includes seeing an ad but not engaging with it. It includes getting recommendations from colleagues or friends or other community members. And essentially the various touch points that ultimately influence his decision to buy this tool are often ones that you would not necessarily plan for. And they're ones that, or at least they're ones that most marketing teams aren't actively planning for. And they're ones that are very hard to track and very hard to orchestrate in a purposeful way. And I think the key here is just to recognize that this is not really how customers buy. Customers don't buy in this clean linear motion, right? The funnel can be a useful tool for organizing your work, maybe even measuring a reflection of the customer journey, but it is not an accurate representation of the customer journey. This is not how customers buy. When you look at how customers actually buy, it's much more complex than this, right? And Chris Walker did a lot of work to kind of highlight in a tangible way what the customer journey and the buyer's journey might look like. That's what you see over here, that, they go through these various touch points that you cannot track that happen in the dark. This is where the concept of the dark funnel emerged. And essentially, this customer journey is complex, it's messy, and it's essentially when somebody wants to buy, they need to be engaging with your brand long before they decide to buy. They need to be thinking of you as a standard go-to solution for the problem that they're experiencing long before they're even necessarily aware of that problem, or maybe even before they're experiencing that problem. And then very often marketing teams are focusing all of their effort on this last final bit over here, the last click attribution, things like the Google ads, where somebody has done all the research and then they start searching your brand and they click it, and then everyone pats themselves on the back for a good Google ad lead. But the reality is that that person is not buying or coming to you because of that ad. They're coming to you because of all the engagements they've had with your brand, with your identity, with your product, long before they actually search for you on Google. When you look at enterprise, and we work with a lot of enterprise or at least sales-heavy, sales-focused companies, this process looks much more complex. There's way more touch points. There's a much longer buying cycle, can be anywhere from 3 to 6 to 9 to even 12 months. And you have various decision makers, influencers, and users that are a part of this process. So it's really dumbfounding to think about how many marketing teams focus at the last 5% of this journey and ignore the previous 95% of that journey. And I don't use that number as a coincidence. I don't use it randomly. It's really a fact that when you look at all these studies about people being in or out of market, most of the studies show that 90 to 95% of your potential buyers are not currently in market to buy. In other words, if you could fast forward the next 5 years and make a list of all the companies that buy from you, 90 to 95% of them are not buying right now, right? In some companies, it's maybe a bit less. In some industries, it's maybe a little bit more. But fundamentally, most of the people who will buy from you are not buying today. And what we find is, and this is the difference between being out of market and in market. And then we like to make an additional differentiation between being in market and in play. In play is essentially a company that is in market and also actively talking to you or considering your product. For example, they've requested a demo, or they've gotten on a sales call, or they've requested more information. Now, the problem we see with most marketing teams is that they're putting 90% of their resources and efforts into this 4 to 8%, the in market segment. Everyone is competing for the same segment. And when we had evergreen opportunities on Google Ads and SEO and content, you could kind of get away with this if you had a lot of money in the bank. But that reality is changing. And that's why we need to see companies focusing way more on building brand awareness and building authority and educating this 90 to 95% who are out of market, because they are going to enter the market maybe next month, maybe next quarter, maybe next year. But when they do so, if they haven't heard of you, you're going to have a really hard time closing those deals. And of course, you need to make sure that when they actually do come to you, that you're really good at positioning yourself in those sales calls, that you're following up, and that you're actually closing those deals. And what this all kind of comes down to, going after that 95%, it's about changing their perspective. If you're selling a B2B product or service, you're trying to change the way someone works. And if you're trying to change the way someone works, you need to change their perspective. And the only way to change someone's perspective is to have a clear, differentiated perspective yourself. If you're parroting what everybody else is saying, you won't stand out and people are not going to listen to you. So you need to have a clear, differentiated perspective. That's where thought leadership becomes really crucial. Now, thought leadership doesn't mean being a BS LinkedIn influencer. It can, but it probably won't. It's about having a very clear perspective on the market, on the problems you solve, and being able to communicate that in different ways, in a consistent way to the market, to your potential buyers. When we worked with the IT services company Rapid Circle, for example, one of our big focus areas was creating an internal influencer process where we had a lot of smart people in the company, a lot of consultants. They had strong opinions, they had good ideas. We just had to push that out into the market. And this led to things like this AI guide that was promoted on LinkedIn and garnered over 300 comments when it was posted. It led to the Cloud Leadership Show, which is a YouTuber show that we created that garnered well over 15,000 viewers. And it also led to having the CEO pushing video content more consistently. Now, we focused on LinkedIn because that's where the audience of this company was, but it doesn't necessarily have to be LinkedIn, and it doesn't necessarily have to be influencer or creator style content. It has to fit your market. But this led us to influencing 10 big enterprise deals in a very short period. We did the same with the company Cradle, which is a big biotech company creating really innovative, cutting edge solutions. What we did with them is really build on the founder's brand. They were doing something very unique, very cutting edge, using the founder's brand, in this case, again, on LinkedIn, because that's where the audience was, but also focusing on creating Substack style publications, running webinars. And you can see some of the numbers here. The engagement was huge. We managed to more than triple the founder's followers on LinkedIn. We created a webinar that had well over 280 attendees and more than 350 signups. And this allowed us to help influence and create 60 sales qualified interactions. Essentially, we would post these things on the founders' profiles on LinkedIn, of course, working with them to create that content, finding ways to do that in a very lean and effective way. Then we would promote that to their target audience, which is quite broad. They would comment on these posts and engage with these posts, and then we would work with the sales team to reach out to those people. So you're no longer doing cold outreach, you're really going properly after people who know your brand, who've engaged with what you do, essentially. And a final example is the wood manufacturing company Cutr. They were doing a lot of cold outreach. In essence, they needed 10 to 12 cold calls in order to get a meeting. And then we started thinking about, what if we take that list of companies they want to go after and we really make them aware of Cutr, make them aware of the solution, make them aware of the brand, create a lot of value for them. We created a micro podcast with one of the founders who had the same background as the target audience, so it was very relatable. We ran some webinars. We combined this with events, dinners, and meetups. And then finally, we also did some offline marketing, because this is a hardware offline traditional space. We created little wooden parts and sent them in the mail, but this was all focused on the same group of people. And by doing this, we managed to reduce the number of cold calls required to get a meeting from 12 down to 3 to 4. And we managed to drive over 40 meetings a month consistently just with this approach here. Now, the reason this is key is, of course, the thought leadership part is about building authority and putting your brand out there. The account-based marketing part is about organizing this to mimic that customer journey, that weird dark funnel journey visualization I showed you earlier. We're trying to create those touch points, and then we use ad platforms to drive in a targeted way those touch points towards the people. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody who is out of market is going to come in market just because you target them with a touch point. But every month, your potential buyers, some of them are coming into the market. They're starting to look at solving these problems. They're starting to look to buy. And if they spent the last 3 to 6 months seeing those thought leadership posts, engaging with those YouTube videos, talking to you at events, attending your webinars, those people are much more likely to include you on their day one shortlist and actually start engaging with you to potentially buy your solution. So this is a play that can produce short-term results because it really helps you create value for the people who are currently in the market, but it also creates long-term scalable results. And you can consistently create more value, create more assets. And this is where the account-based factor comes in. If you just put posts out there hoping people will engage, that's not going to happen. The average LinkedIn post with the companies we work with will have a reach of anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000, depending on the founder's following. And then once in a while, you will exceed that 10,000 reach. But most of the time, you're not actually reaching your target buyers at a number or a volume that you would be happy with. And very often you cannot control that the people, the decision makers you want to influence are seeing all of your content, or at least seeing your content enough. And this is where things like frequency, where targeting comes into play, and working with these different touch points. So you take an account-based marketing approach. You make a list of 1 to 200 companies you want to target. You make a list of those decision makers and those people who influence the deals, for example, the users. You create campaigns around this, and then you deliver high-value thought leadership to them in a consistent way. Now, doing this well and not doing this well all comes down to skill, experience, expertise, and that's what we bring to the table. We've created this model. We know it works. We've delivered really good results for companies by using this. And it's really based on the foundations of good marketing, not on the latest trend, tactic, or playbook, which cannot be copied and cannot be replicated in most industries. So this is essentially what account-based marketing and thought leadership is all about. If you would like to explore implementing this for your company, we're happy to have a chat. Our process is very straightforward. We always start with strategic foundations. If you don't have a clear ICP, clear messaging, clear positioning, clear differentiation, this is not going to work. So the first 4 to 6 weeks, we really build that foundation. So you get a lot of strategic input from our team. You really get to build a strong foundation that will improve your entire commercial motion, not just the ABM. And then we implement this ABM campaign for you. And that includes several thought leadership posts per month. It includes all of the engines and processes needed to scale this over time. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of how we operate with ABM and thought leadership. If you want to try and execute this yourself, please be my guest. We know this works. But if you'd like to bring in our team to do this for you, where we can bring the experience, we can bring the know-how, we can bring the expertise, we can bring the processes. And most importantly, when we set this up, we always aim to step out of your business so you can scale it yourself. So in 6 to 12 months, depending on how long you want to keep us on board to run this, we can step out and hand it over to your internal team, and you can run this in the long run. So if you have any more questions, feel free to check out our case studies, check out this page that you're currently on, and don't hesitate to reach out to us and book a call, and we can talk about how this could work for you.